In 1886, in Panther Creek Valley, Tennessee, 15 miles from civilization, sisters Eva and Marcy Lowe were pregnant by a wild man who lived in caves in the mountains. Eva, who was 19, died from injuries she got during childbirth. What happened next was even worse. People in their community had known about Silas Willow for years but didn't say anything. How did this predator stay hidden? Why did the Hollow put reputation ahead of justice? Subscribe to make sure that people like Eva and Marcy are never forgotten. In the comments, please tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. In the winter of 1886, Panther Creek Valley was a place where the world shrank to the width of a single wagon trace. From November to March, even that thin thread of connection to civilization disappeared under snow and mud. The Hollow cut deep into the mountains of Bledsoe County, Tennessee. It was a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridges that blocked sunlight from reaching the valley floor for only a few hours each winter day. In this remote part of Appalachia, 47 people lived in 9 families. The cabins were on any flat ground that could be claimed from the mountainside, and there were footpaths that connected them. These paths became dangerous when it was icy and hard to see when it was foggy. Pikeville, the closest town, was 18 miles away over rough terrain that was hard for even experienced riders to handle. In the winter, that distance felt like 100 miles. The families of Panther Creek Valley lived by farming on rocky land, hunting deer and turkeys that moved through the laurel thicket, and gathering ginseng and other medicinal roots that they could trade for the few things they couldn't make themselves. They weren't rich, they didn't go to school, and they didn't really care about what was going on in the world outside of their mountains. People from the outside world were looked at with suspicion, as if they might bring back stories or judgments about mountain people who were already seen as strange and backward. The Lowe family had lived in this closed-off world for 7 years, but they had never really fit in. Parthenia Lowe was a widow from Chattanooga. She had once been a teacher, and her speech still had the rhythms of educated society instead of the Appalachian dialect that was common among people who lived in Native Hollow. She moved to Panther Creek Valley in 1879 after her husband Samuel died in a warehouse accident, leaving her with 2 young daughters and not enough money to live in the city. Her brother's family took them in and gave them a cabin on their property and a place to stay in the Hollow's harsh but dependable rhythms of life. Parthenia had done her best to adjust. She had learned how to store food for the winter, card wool, spin thread, and run a household on the least amount of things she could buy, but she never stopped doing things that made her stand out. She made sure her daughters learned to read and write by using her late husband's Bible as both a religious book and a book for learning. She spoke in full sentences and didn't use the colorful swearing that most people on the mountain did. She kept her cabin cleaner than it needed to be to stay alive, as if keeping it up to Chattanooga standards might somehow keep her connected to the life she had lost. When they got to the Hollow, her daughters were 11 and 8 years old. They were old enough to remember their father and their old life, but they were also young enough to adjust to life in the mountains more easily than their mother. By the winter of 1886, Evangelina, who was known as Ava by everyone who knew her, had turned 19. People in the Hollow knew her as a kind person who was always willing to help with the difficult births that happened too often in a place where women gave birth without medical care and relied on the knowledge of midwives and the mercy of Providence. Ava learned these skills by helping doctors who came to the mountains from time to time. She was naturally calm during medical emergencies, which made scared mothers happy to have her around. Marcy's younger sister, Marcelin, was 16 that winter and had a different personality. She was more lively and outspoken than Marcy and was especially good at finding the medicinal plants that grew in the mountain forests. Marcy could find ginseng root in places that other gatherers missed. She could tell golden seal, bloodroot, and black cohosh apart by their leaves alone. She had learned from older women which preparations helped with fever, eased the pains of childbirth, and could be used to treat the coughs that mountain families had all winter long. Both sisters were hardworking and humble. They helped their neighbors even when those neighbors made rude comments about the Lowe family's outsider origins and their mother's pretensions. The girls had learned how to deal with the complicated social scene of the Hollow, where every family had ties of blood or marriage going back generations, and feuds could last for decades over property lines or perceived insults. where reputation was more important than almost anything else, because it decided whether your family would get help when things got tough or have to deal with them on their own. Ava and Marcy knew that their family situation was unstable, that they would never be fully accepted in Panther Creek Valley, and that their mother's education and their own reading skills made them useful but also strange. Like young women everywhere, they both hoped that they would one day get married and start their own families, maybe with young men from nearby hollows who wouldn't have the same prejudices as families in Panther Creek. But by the winter of 1886, those hopes were about to be dashed in ways they couldn't even begin to imagine. There was a man who lived in the caves that dotted the limestone ridges above the hollow. He was so small that people hardly even knew he was a man. The older people in Panther Creek Valley remembered Ezekiel Wollo, a Confederate deserter who had run away to these mountains in 1863 to avoid being executed for leaving his unit. Ezekiel had brought a woman with him whose name no one remembers now. They had gone into the cave systems that honeycombed the ridges and lived like animals in the stone chambers that stayed cool in the summer and only got cold in the winter. People sometimes talked about seeing the deserter, smoke rising from strange places on the mountainside, and strange shapes seen at dusk. Then, in the late 1872, after Ezekiel probably died, people started to notice a younger man who moved through the forest like an animal and came to Ebenezer Cutshaw's country store about twice a year to trade bundles of pelts for salt, cornmeal, and lamp oil. Cutshaw, who owned the only store and post office at the head of the valley, told anyone who asked that the man had eyes like a spooked deer and hands that move like paws. He spoke in short sentences, grunts, and single words instead of full sentences. And he smelled like dirt, musk, and dirty hair. He wore clothes made from animal hides and burlap sacks sewn together, and he always stood with his back hunched forward, as if his spine had bent from years of crawling through low cave passages. When people talked about him, they called him the caveman. They didn't think of him as a person with a name and a history, but as a curiosity or a force of nature. People told kids to stay away from some parts of the mountain, like they did with cliffs and sinkholes. But no one talked about specific dangers because that would mean admitting things the community would rather not talk about. In the fall of 1886, the first sign that something was very wrong came. Ava had gone out one September afternoon to pick the last blackberries of the season from the brambles that grew thick along the ridge above their cabin. Parthenia wouldn't understand how important this was until months later. After living in the hollow for 7 years, she knew the area well. She knew which paths were safe and which ones led to drop-offs hidden by bushes. She also knew to look out for copperheads sunning themselves on rocks and to listen for the sound of a rattlesnake that had been disturbed. She left the cabin soon after lunch, carrying a woven basket and wearing her oldest dress because blackberry thorns would rip any other fabric. She thought she'd be gone for maybe 2 hours, which would be enough time to fill her basket and get back before the valley got dark in early fall. Ava didn't come home for 6 hours. As it got dark, she stumbled through the cabin door. Her dress was torn and muddy, her basket was empty, and her arms were covered in bruises that looked like finger marks. Parthenia jumped up from her sewing in a panic and reached for her daughter. Ava pulled away from her touch in a way she had never done before. When Parthenia asked Ava what had happened, she gave her bits and pieces of an answer that didn't quite make sense. She said she had seen a black bear and run away from it. She said she had fallen while running and that the bear had not followed her, but she had been too scared to go back for her basket. The story seemed true, but there was something about it that Parthenia couldn't put into words. There were a lot of bears in these mountains, and it was smart to run away from one. But Eva's arms were bruised in a way that made it look like someone had gripped her hard enough to leave the clear outline of fingers. When Parthenia asked for more information, Ava got upset and went back to the small room she shared with her sister, where she refused to talk anymore. Ava's behavior changed in ways that worried everyone who knew her over the next few weeks. The young woman who used to be known for being kind and cheerful became quiet and withdrawn. She stopped going to the quilting bees, where women who were not very happy worked and talked. She jumped at loud noises and stayed away from being alone outside the cabin. She didn't sing while she worked anymore, which was something she used to do all the time. Its absence felt like a presence in itself. Marcy told her mom that Eva cried in her sleep and woke up gasping from nightmares that she wouldn't talk about. When families asked Eva for help during tough births, she went because saying no would have raised questions. However, she did her job with mechanical efficiency instead of the engaged compassion she used to show. Parthenia saw her oldest daughter pull away from her and felt powerless to stop it. She didn't know what had really happened on the ridge that September day and wasn't sure if pushing Eva to talk would help or make things worse. Then winter began to close in on Panther Creek Valley, and it was Marcy's turn to face what Eva had run away from. In late November, just before the first big snowfall, Marcy went to get water from Panther Spring. This spring was far away and stayed unfrozen even in the coldest months because it flowed from deep underground. The low cabin was about a mile away from the spring. A narrow path led through a thick laurel thicket to a small clearing where water bubbled up between rocks and then flowed down the hill to join the creek. Every woman in the hollow made this trip often. It was safe enough that even young girls could go alone, but most women preferred to go in pairs for company on the long walk. Marcy left the cabin in the early afternoon with 2 wooden buckets. She thought she would be back in no more than 2 hours. Parthenia started to feel real fear when 3 hours went by without any sign of her return. After 4 hours, she sent a boy from the neighborhood to look for Marcy on the trail. After 5 hours had passed, and it was completely dark, Parthenia herself took a lantern and started walking toward Panther Spring. She was terrified but couldn't say why. She found Marcy halfway back on the trail, stumbling through the dark with no light, her buckets left behind, her dress ripped, and her lips blue from the cold. The girl was shaking so much that she could hardly walk. When Parthenia wrapped her cloak around her daughter's shoulders and tried to lead her home, Marcy could only repeat parts of words that made no sense because she was so cold and scared. Parthenia, with the authority of a mother who was scared, demanded answers when they got back to the cabin and Marcy was wrapped in blankets by the fire. This time, she wouldn't accept excuses or half-hearted explanations. This time, she needed to know what was going on with her daughters in these mountains that had seemed harsh but doable until now. And finally, with tears in her eyes and chattering teeth, Marcy told the truth that would change everything. The caveman, she said. The caveman had been to the spring. He had come out of nowhere, moving through the laurel without making a sound, and he had grabbed her before she could run. She said his hands were like claws, his hair and beard were matted, his eyes looked at her like a hunter looks at a deer, and he smelled like dirt and animal musk. She talked about how he had held her down even though she fought back, how he had seemed confused by her fear and resistance, and how he had made noises that might have been attempts at speech but weren't quite words. And when it was over, he just let her go and vanished back into the laurel, just as quietly as he had come. She was left shaking in the cold next to the spring. Parthenia felt like the world was tilting under her as she listened to her youngest daughter talk about an attack that she hadn't fully understood could happen in their isolated hollow. She then looked at Eva, who had been listening from the doorway, and saw her oldest daughter's face confirm what Parthenia had been too naive or too stubborn to see. It had also happened to Eva on the ridge in September. The story about the bear was a lie that came from fear and shame. The caveman that the hollow talked about as if he were just an oddity, a hermit to stay away from, but not a danger to face, had attacked both of her daughters. The winter that came after was the longest of Parthenia Lowe's life, not in months, but in growing fear and hard choices. By February 1887, it was impossible to hide or explain Eva's condition any longer. The girl was pregnant, and even though she wore loose layers of winter clothes to hide it, her belly was starting to show. Parthenia lived in a place where getting pregnant outside of marriage meant permanent social ruin. A woman's reputation could mean the difference between her family getting help or being shunned when they needed it. She had to make choices that all led to some kind of destruction. She could tell Eva and Marcy what had happened, but that would mean admitting that her daughters had been attacked in public, which would end any chance they had of having respectable marriages and mark them forever as women who had been attacked. She could say that the child was an orphan from a dead relative and that they were adopting him or her, but that would require planning and coordination that she didn't think she could handle. Or she could try to keep Ava's pregnancy a secret. keep her daughters close to the cabin all winter and spring, and hope that they could get through this storm without the community finding out about their shame. Parthenia chose to be quiet and hidden because she couldn't see any other way that wouldn't hurt her daughters even more than they already had been. She started saying no to requests for Eva's help with births, saying the girl had a fever that wouldn't go away. She stopped going to community events herself, saying she had to take care of her sick daughter. She kept both girls close to the cabin so they wouldn't have to see or talk to neighbors who might notice Eva's changing body or see the trauma in both girls' faces. It was a plan that came from desperation and was shaped by a culture that taught her that a woman's violated body brought more shame to her family than the man who violated it did. But in early March, when Ava went into labor weeks earlier than Parthenia had planned, the girl's screams of pain echoed across the hollow in the middle of the night. At that point, the story of illness could no longer be kept up. Parthenia sent a boy from a neighbor's house through dangerous spring floods to Pikeville with an urgent message for any doctor who could be found. The doctor who usually worked in the mountain communities was out on another call, but Dr. Temperance Aldridge Puet, who was 9 miles away from Panther Creek Valley visiting a patient, heard about it. That spring, Dr. Puet was 54 years old. She was a woman who had trained at the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania in the 1852nd, when there were fewer than 300 female doctors in the whole country. She had lost her husband 11 years before and moved to East Tennessee in 1878 to start a traveling medical practice that served Appalachian communities that other doctors didn't want to go to because they were too poor, too isolated, and too dangerous for the small amount of money they could make. People in the mountains knew her as strict but kind. She had amazing physical strength for a woman her age and was willing to ride through any weather to get to patients who needed her. Dr. Puet got to the low cabin on the evening of March 7th after a long, hard ride through mud and swollen creeks that almost knocked her horse off its feet twice. Even a doctor with less experience and strength would have been tested by what she found inside the small cabin. Eva Lowe was in the 19th hour of a painful labor. The baby was in the wrong position and was having trouble getting into a birth canal that had signs of old trauma and new injury. Parthenia and Marcy had been trying to help Eva through her labor the old-fashioned way, like mountain midwives do, but they were too tired and not skilled enough. Dr. Puet took charge with the calm authority of someone who had delivered over 400 babies in her career. She examined Eva and knew right away that she would need all of her medical training to save either the mother or the child. The next 19 hours put Dr. Puet through tests that were very different from what he usually faced in his medical work. She was able to turn the baby around, give birth to the premature girl despite the problems, and stop the bleeding that had started with techniques she had learned decades ago in Philadelphia. But Eva's internal injuries were very bad. Dr. Puet said they were consistent with not only a difficult birth, but also with violent trauma that had happened months before and had never properly healed. Dr. Puet started to see that there was more to the story than just a young woman's tragic death during childbirth as she worked through that long night and into the next day. She fought to save Eva's life while Parthenia held her daughter's hand and Marcy boiled water and ripped sheets into bandages. Ava was alive during the birth and the day after, long enough to hold her tiny daughter and whisper bits of explanations to Dr. Puet during the short times when fever and delirium let go of her mind. Ava said, "The caveman. He doesn't know what he's doing. He thinks we're deer. He thinks this is natural. I tried to run, but he's so strong. Marcy, too." Others, too. Dr. Puet wrote these down in her medical journal with the care of someone who was just starting to learn about forensic medicine. At first, she wasn't sure if the fever was causing hallucinations or if Ava was talking about real events. But when she looked more closely at the damage inside, when she saw the patterns of old scars next to the new ones from childbirth, she started to think that Eva's last words were not crazy, but real. Eva Lowe died on the 8th of March, 1887, at the age of 19. After fighting for 36 hours, her body finally gave in to blood loss and infection. Her baby girl lived 3 days longer, but she was too young and hurt to live even with Dr. Puet's best efforts. The community insisted on burying the body right away so that the smell of death wouldn't spread through the warm spring air. They also pressured the doctor to write puerperal fever on the death certificate, since childbed fever was common enough that it wouldn't raise any questions or invite any scrutiny. But Dr. Puet had not spent decades fighting for respect in a field that barely recognized women's right to practice medicine, only to lie about it when it mattered most. She wouldn't sign a fake death certificate. Instead, she wrote, "Death from internal trauma complicated by childbirth," which was technically correct, but vague enough that it would need to be explained if anyone bothered to ask. The community's anger at Dr. Puet's choice to write an accurate death certificate made it clear what she was up against. A few empty families told her directly to mind her own business and let them handle their own problems. When she came to Panther Creek Valley this time, the doors that had opened for her before were now closed in her face. Dr. Puet's gut feeling, which she had honed over decades of working as a doctor in places where women's pain was often hidden behind walls of shame and silence, told her that Eva's last words needed to be looked into more closely. She chose to stay in the area for another week and offer free medical exams to any women and children who would take them. She used these visits to quietly gather information about births and injuries that might show a pattern. During those 7 days of closely watching and asking questions, she found out what she had feared most. She looked at 3 young children, ages 1, 2, and 4, from different families. All 3 had similar developmental problems and a unique port wine stain birthmark on their left shoulders. When she asked the mothers about the circumstances of these pregnancies in a gentle way, they avoided the question and seemed scared. However, she also saw signs of old trauma. In 2 of the mothers, healed tears and scars that were consistent with violent assault in her medical journal. The women didn't want to talk about their births in detail. They changed the subject or said they couldn't remember, and their bodies were tense with anxiety that Dr. Puet recognized as the result of a serious violation. Her examination of Marcy Lowe, who is now 6 months pregnant herself, gave the clearest proof. Dr. Puet documented the girl's internal damage with clinical precision, and her heart broke for what this 6-year-old child had gone through. At first, Marcy didn't want to talk about how she got pregnant because she was afraid it would make her mother and herself feel worse. But Dr. Puet's method combined medical authority with real compassion. After several visits, during which he asked the girl patient and persistently questions based on promises to keep her safe, she finally told him what had happened to her and Eva. She told Dr. Puet about the caveman who lived in the limestone caves near Panther Spring. She told him how he moved through the forest without making a sound, how he hunched over and gripped things like an animal, and how he spoke in short, broken sentences instead of full ones. She told how he had attacked her at the spring in November, how strong he had been, and how he had seemed genuinely confused by her fear and struggles, as if he couldn't understand why she was scared. Dr. Puet was most worried by Marcy's comment that the caveman didn't seem to know he was hurting people. It sounded like he was trying to say something like help or good, as if he thought he was doing something good instead of violent. Dr. Puet started trying to talk to other women in the hollow, but they were so hostile that it made her previous cool reception seem warm by comparison. Men told her that making trouble would only make the women feel worse, that some things were better left alone, and that people from outside the area shouldn't judge people from the mountains. Women wouldn't talk to her at all or said they didn't know anything strange was going on. The silence was planned and worked together. The community chose to stay quiet to protect itself from being seen, even if that meant letting a predator keep hunting. Finally, an old woman named Keturah Tipton, who was the hollow's main midwife and had the power that came with age and important skills, spoke to Dr. Puet in a way that no one else had been willing to do. Everyone called her Granny Tipton. She was almost 70 years old, the head of one of Panther Creek Valley's founding families, and the person who knew more secrets than anyone else in the hollow. She told Dr. Puet that they all knew about the caveman, that they had suspected for years what he was doing, and that they had told their daughters to stay away from Panther Spring and some other remote areas. But what else could they do? Granny Tipton asked, in a way that was almost cruel. Send him to jail and let everyone know what happened to their girls? Ruin the reputations of women who still had to live in this hollow and find husbands and raise families? It was better to keep the shame to yourself and accept that some dangers were just part of mountain life, like bears and rattlesnakes and winter storms that killed livestock. That night, Dr. Puet wrote in her journal that she had come to realize that being alone not only made people stupid, but also gave them a moral compass that was so different from civilized society that it was almost barbaric. In any simple way, these people were not bad. They lived in a culture where a woman's assault hurt her more than it hurt her attacker, where family honor was more important than individual justice, and where the community's reputation was more important than protecting individual women from ongoing predation. They chose terrible pragmatism over justice, which let Silas Gwillow keep attacking women for years. Dr. Puet had to choose between honoring the community's wish for silence and telling the police what she had found, even though they might not care about mountain women any more than the hollow itself seemed to. For days, she thought about this question. She knew that bringing the police into Panther Creek Valley would ruin people's reputations and reveal embarrassing secrets, and that the women who testified would pay a high social price for being honest. But she also knew that Eva Lowe was dead, that Marcy Lowe and a few other women had permanent physical and emotional scars, that children had been born into situations that no child should have to deal with, and that Silas Gwillow would keep hunting women in these mountains as long as his body could handle it. Dr. Puet rode 18 miles to Pikeville in early April 1887. She brought with her her medical journals and the detailed notes she had made over weeks of research. She was going to see Circuit Judge Augustus Meriwether Thorne. He rode around Tennessee's mountain counties 4 times a year, bringing the law to areas that usually preferred to settle disputes through family ties and traditional codes of honor. That spring, Judge Thorne was 61 years old. He had fought in the Mexican War and had worked as a lawyer in Knoxville before being named circuit judge for the Mountain District in 1868. People knew him as a man who strongly believed that the rule of law was the basis of civilization. For almost 20 years, he had been trying to bring consistent legal authority to places where personal vendetta and clan loyalty had always been more important than any formal court system. When Dr. Puet showed her evidence, Judge Thorne listened closely. He had heard a lot of disturbing stories over the years, but he was still able to be shocked by how cruel people can be. At first, he didn't believe it, because stories about wild men living in caves were common enough in mountain folklore that they could be written off as superstition or exaggeration. But there was no way to argue with Dr. Puet's medical records. She had notes from Eva Lowe's autopsy that showed injuries inside her body that could only have happened in a violent attack. She also had records from Marcy Lowe and other women that showed patterns of trauma and her careful observations of children who shared certain physical traits that suggested they were all related. Judge Thorne knew that he was looking at proof of years of systematic predation while the whole community chose to stay quiet instead of seeking justice. He issued a warrant for Silas Gentry Wylow's arrest on assault charges and, if further investigation shows that Wylow's actions could be legally linked to Eva Lowe's death, murder charges as well. Deputy Marshal Wycliffe Boone, a 5-year-old former Confederate soldier who became a police officer after the war because farming wasn't making him enough money, was in charge of carrying out this warrant. Boone was a big guy, over 6 feet tall and very strong. He had the patience and determination needed for law enforcement in huge rural areas where criminals could hide in thousands of acres of wilderness. He was born in Bledsoe County, so he knew a lot about mountain culture. He also knew when to push for information and when to wait instead of using force. Boone thought it would be easier to get a group together to go into the cave system near Panther Spring, but it turned out to be harder than he thought. Most of the local men said no right away. Some said the caves were cursed or haunted. Others said the caveman would kill anyone who entered his territory. And still others just didn't want to get involved in what they thought was outside interference in their own business. Boone finally got 3 men to agree to go into the caves, promising to pay them with county money and appealing to their sense of duty to protect their own families from a predator who didn't care who he killed. Boone didn't want to bring a woman into what could become a violent confrontation, but Dr. Puet insisted on joining the posse anyway. She said that she needed to be there to properly document evidence and positively identify Silas Gwillow because she had talked to several people who had described him. Boone understood why she was making her case, even though he was worried about her safety. He agreed that she could go with them as long as she stayed behind the armed men if things got violent. On the 14th of July, 1887, the group set out, riding toward the head of Panther Creek Valley while morning fog still hung in the low spots. Marcy Lowe, who was 8 months pregnant and lived with the memory of what Silas Vullo had done to her and her sister every day, gave clear directions to the cave entrance. She said it was hidden behind a small waterfall near Panther Spring, and thick curtains of mountain laurel and rhododendron made it almost impossible to get to on either side. She told them that the way there was dangerous even without thinking about what they might find inside. She said that the trail was barely wide enough for one person, that loose rocks on the cliff face above could fall without warning, and that the laurel thickets were so thick in some places that a person had to crawl through gaps between the twisted branches. The journey took up most of the morning, and the 5 riders had to get off their horses and walk them over ground that was too steep and rocky for safe riding. They could hear the water before they saw it as they got closer to Panther Spring. The sound of rushing water would drown out other sounds and make it hard to hear someone coming. The spring came from the bottom of a limestone cliff. Cold water flowed from deep underground sources all year long, making a small pool before flowing down the hill to feed the creek below. The waterfall Marcy had talked about was small, maybe 8 feet high, but it made a curtain of water that completely blocked the cave entrance behind it. To get to the opening in the rock face, someone would have to wade through the pool and push through the falling water, which would expose them completely. While doing this, Deputy Boone carefully arranged his men so that 2 of them with rifles were covering the cave entrance, while he and the 3rd man got ready to go inside. Dr. Puet stood behind the cover, ready with her medical bag and a journal to write down what they found. Boone and his friend waded into the pool, where the cold spring water soaked them to the waist. Then they pushed through the waterfall and into the dark beyond. The men outside had to wait and listen for a long time. All they could hear was the constant rush of water, and all they could see was the silvery curtain of the falls. Then Boone's voice called out that they had found the cave, which looked like it went deep into the mountain. He was going inside.